messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome.
Global security architecture, a light topic for this very warm afternoon, I guess. My name is Romain Lequigno. I'm the managing director of Eurocreative, which is the first French think tank focusing specifically on Central Eastern Europe. And I'm very proud to be here because, first of all, thanks a lot for the organizers to put this session, because I think it's a very interesting session. But also on personal level, I'm very happy to be here because I used to be a student in this beautiful city of Aix-en-Provence. So that's a great thing to be here again and to talk about security, because this is the topic that we are all talking about days and days and days. This is very important. Of course, we know, nothing to remind you, this is about Ukraine since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but this is also about the Middle East and the tensions that we have today, also in the Gulf countries. We will come back to this, and also tensions in Asia, and, well, frankly speaking, a bit of everywhere in the world at the moment. But security is not just hard security and military stuff. This is also about soft security, and here we can talk about democratic security, we can talk about the governance of digital, of AI, we can talk about climate, of course, and we can talk about economic security. This is about how we will find a way to be resilient as societies, as countries, as states, as European Union, but also how we will build together global governance for those topics, because, as you know, multilateralism is a bit in crisis. And so those are the topics that we will deal today. We will first answer a very easy question, which is, what is going on? How is the security architecture, the global security architecture these days? And second question, which is a bit more prospective, what can we do about this? So easy questions, just 55 minutes I've heard, but I will be helped by our wonderful guest today. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Omar Ashour. You are professor from Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Welcome. We have also on my left Rob De Wijk. You are founder of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies from the Netherlands. We have also Céline Kaufmann, who is program director of the Institut du Développement Durable et des Relations Internationales, l'IDRI. And last but not least, we have Simon Radford. You are director of Milken Institute from the UK. So welcome you all. And as a welcome gift, I would like to ask you the same question, a very short question. So please be focused, try to answer in 1 minute, because what I want to ask you is basically, what is your diagnosis of the current global security architecture? Do you see it mostly as something, which is a process of adaptation, or this is mostly about a continuous fragmentation, or are we experiencing a genuine rupture? And I would like to ask you first, Rob, to start.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. This is a permanent rupture. The things are changing completely. And I think that should be acknowledged. Politicians should be aware of this. It all started not with Trump. That is what quite a few people think. It started, let's say, 25 years ago, when China became a member of the World Trade Organization. Then we saw gradually changing the rules-based order in the advantage of, for example, countries like China. So there is really something going on, and that means that the traditional world order, as we know it today, or until recently, is dying. We live in an interregnum. So the old world order has died, but the new doesn't still exist. That is bad news for us, because that means that the world will move from crisis to crisis, and that is something that probably will still with us for maybe 10, 20 years, something like that, because that is normally what will happen if you have a rupture like this. And then the whole world will settle down with a new hegemon. And then you will have normal relations again. But the world will change completely. The world will change into a more transactional world. That means that zero-sum games are really on the agenda. This is power struggle, and we Europeans, and that's my final word, have to learn how to deal with a new situation, because this is completely opposite to what we've experienced over the last many decades, maybe even centuries, And we have to adapt to this new world where the power shifts from the US to China, if we want it or not.
Yes, Omar, do you think also that the old world is dead or dying?
So it's not dead, but it is very sick, I would say. It's not a total rupture, but it's a partial rupture. And why do I think that? So the world where the United States provided security provisions, the world when one state, a larger state like Saddam's Iraq, invades a smaller state like Kuwait, and the United States mobilizes 900,000 soldiers from all over the world, from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, Europe, and liberates the country after 100 hours ground fighting and 37 days air operation, that world is over, okay? Why? Because if you fast forwarded, and I agree totally, it did not start with Trump. It's actually, the highlight was during the Obama years. In 2014, and by the way, Kuwait did not have a security agreement with the United States. Kuwait was not part of NATO. It did not sign any defense agreement with the United States. The United States did this as an initiative without a binding document. Fast forward to 2014, and you'll find the Russian invasion, first invasion of Ukraine, annexing Crimea and invading parts of the Donbass. And the United States and also another country, the United Kingdom, had a document that is called the Security Assurances for Ukraine, Budapest Memorandum for Security Assurances. They were supposed to security assure Ukraine, and instead, rather than mobilizing 900,000 soldiers and a global coalition to stop the invasion of Crimea or to liberate Crimea afterwards, they asked the Ukrainian armed forces not to fight. This is under the Obama administration, it's documented now, and under also the German chancellorship under Merkel. So that's the contrast, if you wish, and it highlights how ruptured is that. But why am I saying it's not over yet? Because actually sometimes in 2017, Qatar almost got invaded. So a small country almost got invaded. And basically under the Trump administration, mainly because of the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, the invasion was stopped because of US pressures. So it's not totally over. And NATO still works, and this is the good news, because there's a reason Ukraine was invaded but not Estonia. Ukraine in 2022, in January 2022, Ukraine had 21 maneuver brigades, okay, larger than any conventional force in Europe. It was the largest ground-based air defense park in the entire continent. Okay, it still got invaded. Estonia was not invaded, which is a much smaller country, much smaller force, much vulnerable, but it was part of NATO. So in that sense, elements of that old structure, old system is still working. It's still deterring. It may deteriorate even further, but it's still there. We better keep it. But also we have very new dynamics. And one final dynamic of it is now very difficult because of the technology, because of the democratization of forces, if you wish, in one way. It is very difficult for a large state, including the United States or the Russian Federation, to defeat a smaller state. And we see this very clearly in Ukraine, we can elaborate on that, but also we see it very clearly in Iran, with 21,000 strikes, decapitation of the entire political and the military leadership at one point, and 40 days later, Iran is standing on both feet and punching with both hands, ending with 100 waves on Israel and 100 strikes on the Gulf in the 40th day.
Yes.
So
we will continue on this. Céline, we heard about full rupture, we heard about partial rupture. Where do you stand there?
I'm not going to answer your question, but
Perfect.
I'm going to give you 3 points.
Perfect.
Maybe to come back to what you were saying earlier, Romain, first, that we have to understand security in a broad sense, going beyond peacekeeping and defense, because this is the way individuals and countries alike understand their security. They don't limit it to military security. And the pandemics, the natural disasters, the extreme weather events, the macroeconomic imbalances are all creating frictions and affecting that security. That's why, if you follow a bit the discussion, political discussions of this year, we've heard a lot about energy security, we've heard a lot about food security, we've heard a lot about economic security. The second message is and it's really about analyzing, the diagnostic that you were mentioning. There is an illusion and a tendency towards autarky, doing it, in small groups or doing it by one country alone. But what the experience tells us is that no country on earth, even the biggest, can actually do it by itself, because all countries are interdependent. They, depend on supply chains, they depend on pollution coming from other countries, they depend on policies adopted in other countries. And so international cooperation, obviously, is the word. And the last message is, there is an international cooperation infrastructure. It comes with the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, a myriad of intergovernmental organizations and initiatives that have developed over the 20th century mostly. But of course, today, those institutions are a bit outdated and they create frustration. They are outdated when you look at the fact that this year, 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed. So they don't deliver on that. They're outdated also because you can see the frustration of a number of countries, including the developing economies, in terms of the development dividends that they've provided. It doesn't mean we need to throw those institutions, out with the water, the baby, and so on, but it means that there's something to fix in those institutions for tomorrow.
Yep. Simon, what's to fix?
What's to fix, what's not to fix might be a quicker answer. First of all, thank you for having me here, and it's an honor to share this panel with such other wonderful guests. Your first question was about the security architecture. Ordinarily, the actual security architecture that we know of and think of tends to only really change after very large wars, maybe even world wars. So we still have NATO. The question is, how useful is it? We still have the UN General Assembly. The question is, how useful is it? We don't really have a new architecture. What's, I guess, is interesting maybe is the new interior decoration within the house that we're building rather than the architecture of the house, and maybe who's in what room and what's happening outside of the house. So in terms of sort of the nature of security, I think fundamentally we've been slow to catch up on this, that what we mean by security and how we measure it has changed. So if you go back to the last Cold War, if I can provocatively call it that, George Kennan basically had a theory of containment that said there were 4 or 5 or 6 industrial heartlands in the world, and that if the West, which was a kind of construction of the time, could make sure the Soviet Union didn't dominate a majority of them, then it could outproduce enough steel, iron, tanks, whatever, to win any war. And then internal contradictions would take care of itself in terms of the Soviet Union, and so it transpired. Today, warfare doesn't look like who can produce the most tanks. It is much more about not necessarily material, it's about the immaterial. It's not just about production, it's about IP plus production. But importantly, it's not about how much stuff can we churn out, which look exactly the same from a factory. It's about how quickly can we change the factory? How quickly can we change the IP? How quickly can we change the design? We live in a world of rapid adaptation and rapid development and rapid capabilities. And that's very different. And weirdly, you could look at Russia before, and you could, IISS does a wonderful thing every year where it lists everyone's military capabilities. And you could say, ooh, I think I could beat that country in a war. It has 10 tanks and I have 15. It doesn't work like that anymore. Intentions are harder to understand. Capabilities are harder to understand. How rapidly you can change and update your capabilities are even more hard to understand. So the architecture that we have, and I'll leave you with this thought, the technologies that are going to define the next security paradigm is AI, quantum, and all the rest of it too. There have been attempts to build some architecture around it in terms of AI safety and other things, but it's very clear there's no interest, really, in building multilateral security architecture around those things. People think of it as a global race, and that's the analogy that's used. And so the question is, will that race throw up a more uncertain world with more miscalculations and war, or is it something that we can bring some transparency, clarity, and stability to?
Very well. Rob, I would like to come back to you and especially jump on this uncertainty and talk about NATO. We already talked quite a lot about NATO, and I'm very happy because in France it has been for many years, a topic that was controversial sometimes, politically speaking, I would say. Since 2022, I would say that, political military elites here have been talking greatly about NATO, as never before, I would say. Why? Because NATO became, or it was clear to everyone that NATO is indeed the key pillar of the security of Europe. At the same time, there is a lot of uncertainty because of the Trump administration, not only but because also of the erratic behavior of the administration, we could say, but also because, you know, we've never been that uncertain about Article 5, which is the basis of NATO. So how do you see it? How do we balance this, you know, this need of keeping NATO and at the same time building European security, maybe without our biggest ally?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that is also the key question. I remember that your President Macron once said that NATO is brain dead. And I believe that this is still the case. We talk very favorably about NATO, but it all comes down about the Article 5 guarantee. Now, if this is not credible, including the extended deterrence obligation of the US, that is about nuclear weapons, then we really have a problem. And we are not certain about this. And I travel around Europe all the time, and also in the Baltic states, and I've never spoken to someone who is really very optimistic about this. So this is really a problem. I remember very well, I think it was 2018, when I attended the NATO summit in Brussels. That was really a historical summit because NATO almost died. That was the first summit attended by Trump. And I remember shaking and trembling. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, came in. He was sitting almost next to me. And he said, well, I think NATO has died. And he told this story also in his memoirs. But it was exactly the reason why I came to the conclusion when Trump was re-elected that probably NATO would not survive. Now, this is really a big problem. And if you look what Trump is doing, he has disregard for the international rule of law. You can say about Maduro, the president of Venezuela, whatever you want, because I really don't like him. But what the Americans did was simply not according to the international law. The same holds true for the bombardments of ships with probably illegal drug transports. You can say on Iran whatever you want about the regime, but what happened there was sheer stupidity. There is an US before and after the Iran war. And I think that is what people don't understand, because what happened, for example, when Trump, after postponing his first visit to China, if you then have a discussion with President Xi, then you lost already. So what happened there is the keys to the world and to world order were handed over during this last visit from Trump to Xi. And that is really quite dramatic for world order. So what should we do in Europe? Should we come up with something completely different, abandon NATO and build another security organization? Well, my advice is don't do this in times of crisis, because we now need the organization. It's not only about Article 5, but it's also about a host of other regulations and functions of NATO. But we can have a further discussion on that. But keep it and develop not a European pillar within NATO, but try to develop a NATO that can function without the US. And we can have a further discussion on that, but it is absolutely doable. And what we see in Europe is the emergence of ad hoc groupings that drive the whole thing forward. For example, we had the so-called Weimar Triangle not that long ago, right after the inauguration of Trump. And this was France, Poland and Germany who tried to take the initiative. Then the UK came in. And we need something like that. We need a security council in Europe, for example. And so what will happen is that we will have a small group of countries driving the whole process forward. That is more or less happening, but it doesn't go fast enough. And there are too many national priorities and preoccupations that really slow down the whole process. And we simply do not have the time for that anymore.
Absolutely. Speaking of not having the time, I guess that in Qatar you had also this kind of impression a few months ago when, you know, a country that is seen as very rich, very stable, then suddenly you had some drones flying over, I mean, in Qatar and in different countries in the region and attacking directly critical infrastructures. That doesn't say that you are at war today, fully war, right? It's not a full-scale war, but still, this is something that has to be fixed. And this is my question for you as well. How do you see this transformation of war? How do you see also the transformation of alliance? Because we talk a lot about the US in Europe, but in your region, you talk a lot about the US as well, because part of the bilateral agreements in the region, the stability of the region, to some extent relied also on a strong partnership with the US. So how do you see it, and how do you see the evolution of the global security architecture considering the new tendencies, hybrid warfare and the stuff?
So there are a lot of similarities between the Gulf security framework and Europe. I think it was one of the famous Belgian statesmen that said that there are two types of states in Europe: small states and states who do not recognize that they are small. So in the Gulf, it's actually like that. That's including the largest one.
We might disagree on this.
Yeah. And with Europe, there's still the French two-dyad nuclear capabilities, which the Gulf lack. And then with the UK, which is not a very dependent and one-leg nuclear deterrence capability, but it's still there. So there's more security, I would say, on the Gulf side, much more experience in terms of combined arms, multi-domain operations, and so on. But just one point on NATO, and I'll return quickly to the Gulf. NATO was enlarged post the 90s with about 15 members, okay? So that's on paper. In reality, it's 65% less soldiers, 55% less tanks, and 35% less artillery tubes. So the actual hardware, the actual power has been decreased, plus the unconventional dimension as well. So that by itself is a signal to the whatever adversary is that we're not as strong as before. So that's one, despite being richer than before. Back to the Gulf. All states in the Gulf are not born equal. So the strategies were different. The Qatari strategy specifically was in a way vindicated, mainly because they approached more of a hedging policy and more of a peace diplomacy dimension. So they were hit less. If you looked at the actual figures, the drones that targeted Doha were about 112. The drones that targeted the United Kingdom were north of 2,200. The ballistic missiles were doubled, so Qatar was hit with about 250 ballistics. The UAE was north of 5,500. So overall, it was the country that embarked on a confrontational policy. It was hit the hardest. The country that was, embarking on mediation and attempting peace diplomacy was still hit, still destroyed some of its very useful facilities. But was hit less, and I was among the scholars who were saying, the battlefield is supreme, and the ultimate word is for the battlefield. Now I'm giving some credit for diplomacy because it made the job of air defense crews much easier in that sense. But is it a new security architecture in the region? Definitely it is. You have now a country that, which is Iran, that did not collapse after significant, I mentioned 21,000 airstrikes plus the new ones. The regime seems to be still intact, seems to very cleverly weaponize geography in a way that is very, had some technological dimension, but also very, very raw. So you have the mines that we had in the tanker war in 1980s. You had the fast attack craft boat, also 1980s technology, nothing new there. Coastal missiles, we had it as well, but they did not have. It was not that sophisticated in the 80s, and they were less numerous. And then the new technology, which is the strike architecture. So the mixture of attacking your adversaries with ballistic cruise, loitering munitions, and drones, all four. So you send the package, and therefore you confuse and make the air defenses, which Ukraine is suffering from, on a daily basis. Most recently, actually this morning. But with the Gulf, it was the same, but lesser in terms of numbers and lesser in terms of the intensity compared to what was going on in Ukraine. But they're also very small countries. So one last bit: the challenge is endemic in the Gulf. Why? All of the targets are immobile, so you cannot move the gas facility, you cannot move the airport, you cannot move the desalination facility. Their location is known on Google Maps. You can find it. If you pre-program Shahed 136s, which is a type of loitering munitions that the Iranians used, you pre-program it before and send 50, 100. If the air defense catches 95, still 5 will do the damage, enough damage. Because the target, you cannot move it, it won't go anywhere, and it's big, and it's vulnerable, and it's expensive, then you are vulnerable for a very long time. And that's the real challenge in the Gulf. And I think Europe is suffering from similar challenges right now. Better air defense, better capabilities, larger countries, but similar challenges.
It's about numbers and capabilities, right? We will talk about this a bit later, but I think that we will just go back also to a larger definition of security and not just military and hard security, even if I really like it. But how basically do you see it, Céline? Because, if I may formulate it like this, one of the victims of, this ongoing militarization of our global scene, basically, is climate change. From time to time we talk about climate change, especially when it's 42 degrees in Paris, but we don't talk about this too much in the end, much less than a few years before. So how do you see the possibility to keep the topics such as climate change into our vision of security of the global architecture, and what is the link basically? Because we talk a lot about resilience. Is resilience the link between soft and hard security?
Yeah, thank you very much. And you're completely right. Everybody can see the backlash on the environment, on climate, on sustainable development as well. And when you look at what has happened in the last few years, the extreme example is of obviously the US, which is actually banning this wording in a lot of international organizations, negotiations, discussion, but they're not the only ones. So what happened is, like in 2024, you may have noticed that half the planet went to the polls. They went to vote. It was a year where there was a lot of change in leaderships, and the leaderships that came in power, most of them were less, sensitive to sustainable development, to the environment issues. So we can date that back to 2024. And of course, it was a reflection of the aspiration of the population that has changed, that we're concerned about economic issues, about, jobs, very concretely on the ground. So we could see that, in the European Parliament as well, and we have a big backlash against what we call the Green Deal, which is the framework that providing the long-term direction for sustainable development in Europe. But to answer your question, I would say reality is sticky. And it's not because you can't say the words climate, sustainable development, and so on, that sustainable development does not invite itself to the table. And I think the latest G7 and to some extent the previous G20 are a perfect illustration of that, because during the last G7 what we had was the Iran war. And the Iran war, in many ways, is a reminder of the vulnerabilities that we suffer from being too dependent on fossil fuels. And after the war break and the Hormuz Strait was closed, there was a lot of discussion on how do we transition away, how do we diversify our sources of energy. That's one example. The second one is referred to your mention of resilience. What we see happening is a growing number of natural disasters related to climate, of extreme weather events like the heat waves that we had in Europe last week and is coming back, And the consequences of that is that in the G7, in the G20, the ministers of finance are discussing the economic impact and instability related to those extreme weather events, impacts, and natural disaster impacts. And they're also discussing some of the financial and fiscal consequences, because what we see in the face of that is that the insurance coverage, even in rich countries, is going down. And so there is an issue for the public budget on how, which is the insurer in the last resort, on how they're going to continue, paying for the increasing impact and cost of these natural disasters and extreme weather events. We've seen as well, the issue of critical raw materials being at the center of the G7 discussion this year. And this is as much about defense as it is about digital transition, as it is about green transition. So even without saying the word, in any case, you're talking about, pieces of the puzzle to move the climate agenda ahead. But, of course, there is, a number of international conventions. There is a number of international instruments that were developed. Especially back in 2015, that was the year of the Paris Agreement on climate. It was the year of the Sustainable Development Goals, an amazing year when you think where we are 10 years after, where countries came together and said we have to cooperate on sustainable development on the Paris Agreement. And those, in a way, frameworks, what they did at the time was to give a long-term direction for countries, right? Because the Paris Agreement was more or less, providing targets on carbon neutrality by 2050, 2060 for countries. The SDGs were giving intermediary targets by 2030. So what they had to do was to anchor directions and expectations for countries. So what's happening today is that we are in the midst of implementing these agreements. And implementation is hard. So at the international level, we had a series of rules that were established, countries agreed on, and is great. But now what we have to push for is the implementation of these agreements. And this is where we're getting at the granular level into the sectoral issues. We're getting into, at the granular level, into some of the lobbies that are actually fighting off because their business model is no longer sustainable. And this is where the international system, going back to what the topic of the discussion, is not completely fit for purpose, because the international framework is good for developing laws, legal frameworks, is not super good at helping with implementation. And this is the major change that we need to see, that the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, that the other instances where this is discussed turns towards helping countries implement those agreements rather than developing new legal instruments.
Absolutely. We will try, Simon, to continue on this linkage between soft security, hard security, and I think that one of the good linkage that we didn't talk too much about is money, and we have a big money problem. We're not that rich anymore. We are not that rich simply, right? And so that's a big problem because, if we talk about climate change, we need to adapt our infrastructures. It costs a lot of money. It's a lot of research and development also. We need to be faster with new technologies to adapt our societies, to adapt our infrastructures, etc., etc. When we talk about drones, massification, not rocket science to build drones, to be honest. It's a bit of AI and like some plastic. It's not very difficult, but you need to restart industries, you need to employ people, so you need money to start the process and to be sure that people, are basically devoted to it in the long term. So my question is basically, if we are talking about rebuilding or reinforcing, strengthening our global security architecture, how do we talk about the financing architecture? And there is one question here, which is related with one big topic we have, which is competitiveness. How can we finally, in Europe, make sure that we ally the private budgets with the private money with the public budgets, and how we make sure to invest smartly, because we will not have the money we want. That's a certitude.
Great question. I think we've talked about the architecture, we talked about the interior decoration, and now you're asking me about the plumbing. So we'll do the whole house. It's great. The answer is, I talked a bit about how it's about rapid adaptation, about applying energy plus technology plus IP and ingenuity and being able to transport it to the front line. And that actually is your hard security advantage. There's not really a hard and soft, it's a hard and soft. The both of them go together. Equally, if we lower and have abundant energy costs, it actually allows us to have an advantage in AI and these other things, and reindustrialization and all the rest of it too. Equally, we saw in Syria with people fleeing a drought there, it creates the rise of far-right parties and misinformation from Russia and other things where they weaponize our communities around some of these things with the refugee problem. So the energy and climate is it's a double helix with hard security. I just wanted to sort of emphasize that. On the financing side, the question is also, to your point, it's about how much capital can you bring to solving some of these problems. And and in some of these areas, government and capital need to work together in a lot closer way. So in the 1940s and 50s, there was central planning from government, and then private markets worked around that. And then maybe in the 1950s and 60s, there was corporatism where the state and big companies worked together. In the 80s, government went out of fashion. The free markets should take care of this all, but it's led to deindustrialization. It's led to financialization, a bit of rent seeking. So now I think we're in a new paradigm where industrial policy is coming back, but it's a different kind of industrial policy. It's around risk sharing. It's around the government being an effective venture partner, working with people who want to put capital to risk. I'll give you a few examples, like hydrogen and other critical technologies. Some of those technologies are not at the stage where venture investors can invest in it. The amount of money for seed stage investors it's too much to get there. The amount of the timeline to where you can actually commercially sell hydrogen is probably more than the 6 to 8 years the most venture funds at a push are going to last for. You need government to be able to de-risk some of these things, whether it's taking on board technological risk, whether it's through things like blended finance approaches, whether it's clearing out some of the regulatory and other things to be able to get money to move so you can de-risk things. So when we look at projects, and I should say the Milken Institute, we have at our global conference, we have about $33 trillion worth of assets at our global conference. So a lot of our policy work is informed by bringing policymakers and those sources of capital together to solve various problems. And we identify problems really at three main levels. One is funding allowed to go into this area at all? So I used to chair a pension fund in the UK. A lot of the time we were not allowed to put money into something which had something to do with defense. Private capital wasn't allowed to invest in weapons. Now, or it would be defensive but not offensive weapons. Now, if you said, or should we only fund defensive weapons in Ukraine? They say, well, that's mad because deterrence involves also being able to hit the other side and not just defense, right? So first of all, it's how can you eliminate some of the rules and other things at the funding level? Then it's getting the financing mechanisms right. Is whatever this investment is on the frontier of the best risk-return options that you have available? I could put lots of money into government debt, safe, 5% now or whatever, pretty good. Why should I put money into a drone company or a series of venture companies that may or may not? Defense, there's only really normally one customer. That doesn't tend to be a very good investment, right? So sometimes you need to take some risk off the table or boost returns if you want capital to flow into that area. And then the last thing is on the asset level itself. So how can you deregulate in certain ways? How can you give permissions for people to operate in certain ways? How can you bring together basic research and commercial opportunities to be able to exploit particular assets? So we look at how capital and policymakers can work together to rewrite the rules so that capital can work. And a final thought, because it's interesting, because you've got kind of two models, right? China is doing things at scale with government capital. Same with Russia. They have massive factories making one types of drones, and they're doing it at scale and very large. In Ukraine, you have a decentralized source of many different startups, many different venture funds. The problem is, can you make them interoperable? And can you scale the ones which are really, really good? And so there's pluses and minuses of both systems. And so what we need to do is we need to counteract the flaws of a decentralized capital-led system. But that means being a really good partner to the people who want to take the risk and want to put their money on the line. At the moment, if people are taking lots of risk, designing things, doing prototypes, and then government doesn't place the orders, that company will go out of business. So you need government to be there, understanding what are the incentives and the rules by which your partners are playing, and have a really partner-led approach to developing and scaling these capabilities. And at the moment in Europe, I feel like we're being too slow. I'll end with one example because I don't want to talk too long. The Europe Scale Up Fund is a wonderful thing, and EQT is a wonderful investor, and I think it's a really great thing. It's 8 billion euros. One local government pension fund, one of 32 local boroughs, is 1.7 billion. I mean, the scale-up funding gap, that gap in the middle of the capital stack, is far bigger than 8 billion euros. So we need to have a savings investment union. We need to get going on that. That means some national governments doing things that are going to make them unpopular, to do pension reform. We need to find ways to lower energy costs and lower the fixed costs that all these companies face. And we need to get capital moving at scale intelligently to solve particular problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Fully agree. I would like to have a third round of questions that is a bit more prospective, and we will come back to this, continental security, and especially, it's often said that the Europeans should be more responsible for their security. Fair enough. We talked about this. What about the global stage? Can the Europeans manage both being more responsible for their own security and at the same time play a role that they at least talk about on the global stage?
Yeah, sure, it can, but it requires a complete mindset shift. And that is something that is quite difficult in Europe. We've become postmodern, so we don't do power politics anymore. We have to relearn that. We believe that what is happening within Europe also happens outside Europe. And we simply forgot that raw power politics are normal outside Europe. This is also, let's say, what happened because of the European Union. We organize mechanisms to deal with our problems in Brussels. And we simply cannot use the old mechanisms anymore outside the European Union. And that is really a big problem. So in the field of economics, we should change completely, but also in the field of defense. Can we do that? Yes, of course we can do that. If you look at the pile of documents produced by the European Commission, on economic affairs, from Letta to Draghi. Everything is there. If you look in the field of defense, everything is there. And that is, in a way, that is easy to do. We can do it. But what we should not do is ignore the state of the world, how it is changing, that it has become more transactional, that the world is a rougher place. We have to relearn that. And if we don't do that, then we're out of business. And there is, for example, a new report published by China which on global governance. Now, if you read it, it's fine. You will agree with everything. Because it's about cooperation, it's about win-win, and all the blah blah. That is European language, almost. Now, if this is true, why don't you put pressure on President Putin to stop this crazy war in Ukraine? So this is really problematic. So we in Europe should not look only outside, and Europe includes the European Union and the UK, but we should come up with an idea how to change Europe without giving up our values and become less blackmailable, because we are blackmailable in this part of Europe. We can do it. And then people say, well, it's expensive. But changing your defenses in Europe is not that expensive. It is not true that it costs €1 trillion and 10 to 20 years. No, you can do it quite rapidly, but then you have to work with Ukraine. Because drone defense, I was not long ago at the border of Belarus, and a couple of weeks ago I was in Ukraine. And if you look what they do there and how expensive it is, it's not expensive at all, so you can do it. But then we really should change, and then we should also say to the US, well, please step back. We do it on our own. Don't abandon NATO or say to the US you should leave NATO. No, if you behave yourself, you're welcome to be back.
Yeah. If we continue, Omar, on the global stage and on the global architecture, if we put it simplistic, there are two camps. The guys that want the status quo, so basically Europeans, Westerners. We don't know if the US is still or not in this camp. It's a bit hybrid at the moment. And you would have, well, let's say these regional powers that are revisionists, right? They want to change, turn the tables, and do it differently. Why not? And then you have most of the countries on the global scene that are basically between the two camps and that are trying to balance and to have an attitude that is basically safeguarding your national interests. How is it perceived by Qatar, and how do you see this impacting the evolution of the global stage?
Okay, so just very briefly on the drone warfare, because it's and on the how Ukraine dumbed down the costs. So it's so we all thought that having the Shahids, the family of loitering munitions that Iran produced, and now Russia is reproducing as Garans. And if you go to Kiev in the middle of St. Sophia Square, you will find a version of it caught, and you can have a picture under it. And it's not very sophisticated, and it costs about, depending on the model, because it's an entire family, from $20,000 to $50,000. Okay. The Ukrainians are countering it in the lower bracket, so below the 10,000 feet bracket, with a counter drone, a counter UAV mechanism that is called, one of the versions, there are like over 20 now, but one of them called the Sting, and it costs 10% of the Shahid, so $2,000. So this is how expensive it is. It's not that expensive. And the drone technology in general is not that, it's not that advanced. Like, the US scored hits, US Navy scored hits on the Imperial Japanese Navy in the 1940s with a drone. It was actually part of the suppressing the Warsaw Uprising by the Wehrmacht was using the Goliath. The Goliath was a demolition vehicle, wire guided. Today we call it an UGV, an unmanned. Of course, it's manned. I'll come to that, but it's called an unmanned ground vehicle. And of course, it's manned because some types of drones, whether ground or air, they need 4 men or women to operate it. So actually, it's very heavy in terms of labor, in terms of manpower use. So the T-72 tank, for example, the Soviet T-72 tanks require 3 men. So the crew is 3. So some types of drones require more than a 1970s technology in terms of the tanks. And this is what I told the Qataris, because the Qataris thought, oh, it's old technology. Let's be Ukraine. To answer your question, and we'll be safe. We'll just do it like Ukraine. And my answer to them always was, you can't be Ukraine. If you can mobilize 20,000 men and women in 1 month, every month, for years, then you maybe can be Ukraine. If you have this kind of mobilization capacity, training capacity, arm them, train them, feed them, organize them, and have men with a lot of experience, because some of them have been fighting for over 10 years now, then you can be Ukraine. But at the moment, none in the Gulf can be Ukraine, and I would argue most Europe cannot be Ukraine. So they are in a league of their own at the moment, and that's why they're very important for NATO, probably as NATO, as they need NATO as well. In terms of Qatar. So the approach now is hedging. So why hedging? So basically we have the general trend is to keep good relations with the US specifically, even though the US looks as more of a disruptor of the international system as opposed to a guarantor of the international system at the moment. China looks more as in terms of its sustainability of the current system, in terms of revisionist power. It looks more as a power that wants to stabilize things as opposed to the US. But of course, it's in its interest to keep atterrating its adversaries, which is us, the West and the US and Europe. Hence the issue of Ukraine. For the Qataris, I think the alliance with the US will continue. I think they are going towards further armaments, which is the entire Gulf is doing so now. But also in terms of hedging, all of the Gulf, including the UAE, are now using this minilateral diplomacy with Iran. Mainly because they realize how tough is Iran and how vulnerable they are.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they are compromising on that dimension. So it's hedging, basically.
Perfect, thank you very much. I want to bring back the topic of climate change and also a bit more about soft security, because I think this is something that we started to talk about and which is very important. It's about how do you basically make sure that, we said, climate change is urgent, right? So this is very needed. We need to take actions, all these things. The problem with urgency is that generally we take very short-term decisions. So how do we put long-term into our architecture today?
Yeah, thank you, Romain. Yeah, there is an emergency, and I think the scientists are super clear on the emergency to act in relation to not only climate but biodiversity as well. We see a collapse of biodiversity that is very, very fast. And the issue we face is that compared to, peacekeeping and so on, we have the false feeling, confidence that we can address climate and biodiversity degradation in a second phase. But the issue that we have is once the temperature rises, once biodiversity collapses, we enter uncharted territories because effects are cumulative. And we don't really know where we're going with the extreme weather events, cumulating, and it affects production means, it affects food security, it affects our everyday life. And so there is an emergency. And the emergency is related to the fact that in any case, we need to put ourselves on a trajectory towards decreasing emissions, for example, towards regenerating biodiversity. Because decreasing emissions is not going to happen from one day to the other. We need to change the infrastructure. We need to change the economic structure. And this all takes time. So, to answer your question, we have to do it at the same time that we actually address our peacekeeping and military security. We can't sequence and say we will come after, because it will be too late. But again, we have the instruments for that. The Paris Agreement, the targets, they were all to give us this long-term perspective and the sense of a trajectory and not of a move from one day to the other. And so we have the instruments. Now we have to be confident that we can address several priorities at the same time and not only one, and that we have to mainstream the climate dimension, the biodiversity dimension in every action that we're taking today, including when we look to securing our security, military security.
Thank you, Simon. And this is the last, because I think that we are almost over time. Yes. The last question is basically bringing a second tension there. And this is the tension between, global challenges that we're facing, but also localization of the decision making. And so how basically, especially at times of populism, we talked about democratic security just a bit, but how do you basically guarantee that our policymakers can act and not be pressured by the local electorates, or just basically favoring short-term, localized, self-interested decisions when we need to act globally? And basically, how can we make international cooperation today in those conditions?
Great question. I think, how do I say this? I don't think we should try and inoculate decisions from the will of the people who we're meant to be representing. We're meant to be trying to, I think, better align them. And so the question is, how do you do that? I think we have an opportunity here in terms of explaining much better than we're doing the nature of the threat. So I think Munich Security Conference maybe 2 years ago, they said, hands up who thinks their country is at war, and almost everyone put their hands up. And they said, who here thinks the people in their country think that they're at war? And hardly anyone put their hands up, right? And we might not be, whether we're at war, there's certainly, we've talked about climate, we've talked about national security, we've talked about the sense of urgency. People don't necessarily have that sense of urgency. So when we're asking people to sacrifice and they don't know what we're asking them to sacrifice for, you're going to get a backlash. So we need to focus some minds. I think we also need to realize that doing the same thing and insisting that the people have got it wrong, let's dissolve the people and elect another, in the words of Bertolt Brecht, isn't necessarily the way to go either, right? So, for example, Brexit is obviously something close to my heart. I think we need to think about a more generous approach to this. We might need to have a monetary euro, we might need to think about a free trade Europe and a defense Europe. We need to think, how do we bring Ukraine and the United Kingdom into a larger sense of the European system? And that might be, I'll give you a sense too. If we're trying to, Europe has a choice about whether it's a buyer or a builder of these critical technologies of the future. And if it wants to have digital sovereignty, it can buy, if it wants, really second-class or third-class European versions, unless it creates first-class versions. And we tried import substitution in Latin America in the 70s, and it didn't end up very good for Latin America. So how do we join together to build that second type of economy, that next industrial revolution, on those technologies that really matter? And it's going to need to have a much more European joined-up approach, but one that focuses on how it can change people's lives and increase, the better the climate they're living in, increase the money in their pocket, their sense of security, resilience. Because competitiveness and resilience are really two sides of the same coin. And I'll end with a final thought, because you said very kindly that we're running out of time, and I don't want...
Allowed.
So I will be
quick.
Very quick. Which is, Europe was founded on this idea of functionalism, right? The steel and community. Yep. At the moment, we have these primes that, Jens Stoltenberg lost an election, very popular man, because he bought frigates from the United Kingdom when all the Norwegians said, but we build ships, what are you doing? With AI, with quantum, with whatever it might be, we have a choice of whether we take a national solution or whether we have a European solution. The total addressable market of Europe makes it much more attractive for entrepreneurs. If we bring European capital to bear, that's a lot more likely that we win the race. We also have really, really great IP and great research in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, in other areas. If we take this larger European approach, we need to think of how do we redesign ourselves, and how do we think about how do we create the national architecture and the European architecture, not just the global architecture, if we're going to win the economy, the national security, and the climate that we deserve for the next 20, 30 years.
Thank you. And I suggest that on this great call for European cooperation for better solutions at the global scale, we will close. I will say thank you to the organizers for this possibility of organizing this roundtable. I think it was a brilliant discussion. Thank you to the audience to stay there until that late, because it's quite hot and warm. So happy that you will still be there. And finally, let me please join me to thank our speakers for this brilliant discussion. Thank you very much.